Let's take a look at this piece of code and let's try and draw a structure chart from this piece of code. Okay, so the most important part here is this main module, right? This is what we're going to focus on. See, in this main module, from this main module we are calling this procedure input num, right? This procedure input num is being called from the main module. So here's what we're going to do. What we're saying here is that we have a main module and that is going to call another module or another procedure called input num. After this, the second procedure that's being called is this procedure, calculate AVG, right? So after input num, the second procedure being called is calculate AVG, and once this procedure is executed, the third procedure that is called is display AVG. Display AVG. So our structure chart is this. So our structure chart is basically telling us, if we take a look at this structure chart, this is basically telling us that first the main module calls this procedure or this module is executed, and then the control is returned back to the main module. Then the main module is going to call this procedure or this module. This module will get executed then, or this procedure will get executed, and then the control is returned back to the main module, and then the main module calls this third procedure. This procedure executes, and once this execution is complete, the control is transferred back to the main module. So a structure chart gives us information about what's happening in this program. Looking left to right, we can say that this is the first procedure that was executed, or that this was the first procedure that was called and therefore executed. This was the second procedure that was called and that was executed, and then this was the third procedure that was called and that was executed. So we have to look from left to right to determine the sequence in which these procedures were called. Okay, so is this structure chart, is this a valid structure chart? And the answer is no, because according to this structure chart, this is the first procedure that gets called, and then the second procedure that gets called is display average, which is not true, right? Because after this, the second procedure that gets called is the calculate average procedure, and then finally the third procedure that is called is the display average procedure. So this is the sequence, right? This is the sequence, right? But here the sequence is different. This structure chart is telling us that the first procedure being called is input num, the second procedure being called is display average, and this is incorrect, because this display average procedure is called last. The second procedure that is in fact called is this calculate average procedure, and this should have been drawn here. So this is invalid, because this is not telling us the right sequence in which the procedures were called. Okay, now we're going to add some more information to the structure chart. We're going to add information about the parameters that are being passed between these modules. So let's take a look at this piece of code, right? And let's see how this piece of code gets executed. This is the first instruction that gets executed. So let me quickly go to my memory and declare num1 comma num2 is basically going to allocate memory space for num1, and is also going to allocate some memory space for num2. And then the next instruction that gets executed, this instruction declare AVG, right, will allocate memory space for AVG, right? So far they've been allocated memory spaces, but no value has been assigned to them. Okay, so let's go back. Now this procedure call is made, call input num, right? So this procedure call has been made, right? Okay, When this procedure call is made, two parameters num1 and num2 are being passed. Let's quickly take a look at our memory. Do num1 and num2 have any value inside of them right now? If they don't have any value inside of them, then we don't need to show anything on our structure chart. So we don't need to show anything on our structure chart when this call is made. When this call is made, we don't need to show anything on our structure chart, because the parameters num1 and num2 that are being passed do not have any value inside of them. Because they don't have any value inside of them, we don't need to show anything right now. Okay, now let's take a look at what happens. Now that this call has been made, this procedure gets executed. So this procedure gets executed, and what we should note is that num1 is being passed by reference and num2 is being passed by reference. So x is directly pointing towards num1 and y is directly pointing towards num2. So in our memory right here, x is directly pointing towards num1 and y is directly pointing towards num2. So if we make a change in the value of x or in the value of y, changing the value of x will change the value of num1 and changing the value of y will change the value of num2, because these are directly pointing towards num1 and num2. And let's take a look at this piece of code here. We are taking value of x from the user and value of y from the user. So let's suppose that the user gives a value of 70 for x and a value of 50 for y, which basically means that our memory is now num1 is going to be updated to 70 and num2 is going to be updated to 50, because x was given a value of 70 and y was given a value of 50. So that updates num1 and num2. Okay, now the thing to consider here is that this procedure has modified the values of the two parameters. It has modified the value of num1 and num2. If the value of the parameters has been modified, then we need to indicate that using an arrow. We are going to say num1 was modified and num2 was modified by this procedure. So this procedure modified the value of num1 and num2. So when this was executed, the value of num1 and num2 got modified. That is why we are showing that this procedure modified the value and then the control was transferred back towards the main module. So this arrow indicates the direction in which the modified values are now going to be passed. Okay, now let's take a look at our code. This is the second module that's being called. This is the second procedure that's being called, and we are passing three parameters. Right. Do these parameters that are being passed have any value inside of them? Does num1 have any value? Does num2 have any value? Does avg have any value? Let's take a look. So when this main procedure at this point in time, when it is calling, num1 has a value 70, num2 has a value 50, but avg is empty right now. So when this call is being made, we are going to show that num1 is being passed from the main module down to calculate avg with a certain value, and num2 is also being passed from the main module to calculate avg with a certain value. But because avg was blank, avg was empty, it had no value inside of it, that is why that has not been shown. Okay, now let's take a look at this procedure. Is this procedure which has now been called, is this procedure going to modify the value of num1 or num2 or avg? As we can see that num1 has been passed by value and num2 has been passed by value. Okay, when we say it has been passed by value, that means that a copy of num1 is going to be passed and a copy of num2 is going to be passed to this procedure, right? To this procedure. So S is going to point towards a copy and T is also going to point towards the copy of num2. So S is going to point towards the copy of num1 and T is going to point towards the copy of num2. However, we can see here that AVG is being passed by reference. AVG is being passed by reference, so Z is going to directly point towards AVG. So Z is going to directly point, Z is going to directly point towards AVG. Okay, so if we modify the value of S, only the copy is going to get modified. If we modify the value of T, only the copy is going to get modified. The original parameters num1 and num2 will not get modified, only the copy gets modified. But if we modify the value of Z, this AVG, which is the parameter that was being passed to this procedure, the value of AVG is going to get modified. So if we take a look here, Z has been passed by reference, and this equation here is modifying the value of Z. Z is being calculated using S plus T divided by 2, and we can see right now from our memory that S equals 70 and T equals 50. So 70 plus 50 would be 120, and 120 divided by 2 would give us 60, right? So that value 60 is being copied into Z. So Z becomes equals to 60 means, so if Z becomes equals to 60, that means what? That means when Z becomes equals to 60, Z is basically pointing towards this location. This value of AVG gets updated to 60. So this procedure right here is modifying the value of Z, which basically means that the value of AVG is being modified. Therefore, when this procedure executes, the value of num1 does not get modified, the value of num2 does not get modified, but the value of AVG gets modified, and we need to show that this procedure has modified the value of AVG before. So this procedure has modified the value of AVG before returning control back to the main module. Okay. Now the third procedure that is being called is the display AVG procedure. Okay, so when display AVG is called, there is only one parameter being passed, and that is the AVG parameter. So when this main module, when the call is being made from the main module to this procedure display AVG, does this parameter have a value inside of it? Does AVG have any value inside of it? And if we take a look here, this has this value 60 inside of it. So there is a value being passed, right, from the main module to the lower module. That is why we are going to display this. We are going to display with a downwards arrow that AVG is being passed with a value towards this module, right, towards this module. Okay. Now let's take a look at this module. When the control gets transferred here, does this module modify the value of the parameter, right? And first thing to note is that a copy of AVG is being passed, because AVG is being passed by value. So result is not going to point towards AVG, but it is going to point towards a copy of AVG. So let's update our memory. A copy of AVG is going to be created, and result is going to point towards this copy. So even if the value of result was modified, which it is not getting modified in our example, but even if it was getting modified, it would have modified the copy here. It would have modified the copy here and not the original parameter, right? Therefore, this procedure that we have here is not modifying our original parameter, and that is why we don't need to display anything once this procedure has executed. So we're not going to have an upward arrow displaying anything, right, because the value of the parameter being passed is not being modified by this procedure. Okay, so that's how parameter values are updated in structure charts. I hope you understand this concept.